All right, so these are notes 4.8, Challenges to Cold War Conformity. This is following our notes on Cold War conformity and how people, because of the fear of communism, were conforming to society. We also had media and advertising that's increasing that conformity and making things available to everyone in the entire country. Cars are allowing more movement and more transportation, the same goods to everyone. So we're really seeing a change in conformity during the time. But there are also some challenges, some groups that refuse to conform, and some groups that just are unable to conform. So we're really seeing some contrasting images. Internally, lots of domestic prosperity. Externally, the fear of communism. Those are adding to the conformity. But not everyone actually has these things. There is not prosperity for everyone. In fact, there's a book written during the time period called The Other America, and it's talking about the people who live below the poverty line. 20% or 1/5 of all Americans live below the poverty line, and half of all elderly Americans live below the poverty line during this time period. Many of these live in rural areas, farming communities, or things like that, or in inner cities. So at the time that we're talking about, where we're seeing the suburbs growing and people are moving out, the only people staying in cities, here's our city picture, the only people staying in the cities are the people who can't afford to move out. So you have a rise in poverty in cities. You have a rise in this whole inner city idea, what today we call ghettos and bad areas of cities. We actually see a decline in cities because of the rise in suburbs. And in rural areas, they still just lack resources, lack money, and we see a lot of poverty. A lot of the people who live both in the inner cities and in the rural areas are minority groups. So a lot of minorities in these groups. So why do they fail to be affluent? Well, urban decline, as I said, we just see less and less prosperity in the cities as people who are prosperous are moving out into the suburbs. There are limitations of Social Security and union organization. In fact, one of the big things here, unions are actually seen as supporting communism. So the idea behind unions is that the workers band together and get things for everyone. That actually is really kind of aligned with communism. So unions are failing during the 50s. Social Security is not able to meet all of the elderly's needs. And we see this decline in those groups. There's also limitations of public housing. So this goes along with urban decline. This is the idea that in the cities, you don't have enough housing for those poor people. In fact, not even half of the units that were authorized to be built in 1949 were built by 1960. So in 11 years, not even half. That means there's just not enough housing to go around. And essentially, urban renewal means you remove the poor people from the city. So if you're trying to make a city grow and a city good again, they actually remove the poor people. So this kind of shows some of the ways that things were not good for some of the Americans. So we had the people who were conforming, the majority of society, and then you have 20% of the country that is unable to conform because they live below the poverty line. Then we have this other group, this group that doesn't want to conform or conforms in a different way. They conform by rebelling together. And that group is teenagers. The term teenager was never really used prior to World War II. There weren't really teenagers. The thing with this is, before this, you became an adult when you were a teenager. You had a job, you worked, you weren't in school, you got married, you had kids. All happened when you were a teenager. So the idea of a teenager is very different. It is unique to being affluent. It's unique to having money. For example, in 1900, only 1 in 8 teenagers was in school. By 1950, 6 in 8. That should say in 8, not or 8. 6 in 8 teenagers were in school. Huge increase in students, huge increase in kids not working. You have to have money if your kids don't work. Think back to the very beginning when we talked about 1900. the kids had to work. Now there's this whole kind of rebellion idea between kids and parents. There's a very different culture between them. The kids, they want to listen to music and dance and hang out and have fun. They have different dress, different hair, different tastes. And the parents all see this as rebellion, while in reality, the kids see it as becoming themselves. So it's non-conformity, but it's kind of to the general society. But they're conforming to this teenage idea. So like I said, they want to hang out. They have boyfriends and girlfriends. We have a couple pictures from Greece here because it's an excellent show of, you had the conformity, Sandy, and the non-conformity, remember the pink ladies and the T-birds, those are kind of challenging the conformity, the rebellion. So you really see that in Greece, but also in some other movies during the time period. And so this really starts to show in the dress. There's the girls in their clothing, and dress, music, all kinds of things during that time. So the rules of behavior during the 50s, and this includes teenagers in it. Obey authority. That was what you were supposed to do. Control your emotions. Don't make waves. Fit in. That ties in with conformity. And don't even think about sex. So those were things that teenagers were supposed to do. However, teenagers were then kind of attracted to this whole new idea of juvenile delinquency. Previously, there wasn't juvenile delinquency at the teenage age. It was at the older ages. And what happened here is you now have teenagers with free time, and you start seeing this. A Catcher in the Rye in 1951 by Salinger. That is an example of juvenile delinquency. It comes out during this period. This novel, some of you might have read it in your classes. The Wild One, 1953. Marlon Brando is the lead character. Again, kind of romanticizing juvenile delinquency. And probably the most famous of all these, Rebel Without a Cause, the movie with James Dean in 1955. Definitely promotes juvenile delinquency and kind of romanticizes that idea. And these were extremely popular during the time because it was really suburbs versus rebels. Suburbs were boring, rebels were seen as hip or cool, as we would call it today. The idea in the suburbs, nothing ever happens, it's boring, we're very misunderstood and alone. And they really are attracted to this whole clash of culture and the ideal of being a rebel, teenager versus parent. And we see that not just in books and movies, but also in rock and roll and the music the kids start listening to, which their parents hate. So rock and roll, 1950s. Grows out of the rhythm and blues tradition, kind of that African-American music, Harlem Renaissance. So kind of takes that from the 20s, expands and becomes rock and roll in the 50s. The lyrics are more explicit. There are also sexual overtones and implications, which is totally against those rules that we talked about. Teens love it, parents hate it. If you guys think about you and your parents and your music, you probably could understand this. And it's going to influence race relations. The concerts are integrated. A lot of the musicians for rock and roll are not white, they're black. So you have white kids going to concerts of black musicians. For example, Chuck Berry. You've got Clyde McPhatter here. The dancing is different. Or as I said, the integrated concerts, here you can see different races at the concert together. So you really start to see integration between the two. And the big 1950s artist that comes out, Elvis. He is a symbol of the rebellious youth. He swung his hips. Oh my gosh, like that's nothing today, but back then that was just crazy. And it was so unheard of that actually the first time he was on the Ed Sullivan Show, they wouldn't show him from the waist down. They only showed the top half of him. The next group that shows the rebellion is the Beat Generation. So this is a group of youth who really kind of protest traditional American values and that whole idea of conformity. The Beatniks, as the group of these kids are called, they're youth who were actually against conformity, and they're much more active against it than the teenagers. They stress spontaneity and spirituality. They are into literature and film. They talk about alienation. So a lot of Catcher in the Rye and that sort of thing coming up here. So as I said, Catcher in the Rye. If you've ever read On the Road by Jack Kerouac, Kerouac is a huge, almost like the person who shows this movement. And Kerouac had a lot to do with Denver. So you actually can go, there was a big beat movement in Denver, so you can go around and find some of their old places, some of the things they did. Ginsberg and Howl, that was his poem. Very famous. Neil Cassidy, William Burroughs. Very different. Maybe you've seen some things like this picture, that style, just very different than the conforming group. A lot of them lived homeless. A lot of them were very much kind of the hippies of the 1950s. So before hippies, we had the beatniks. And here Kerouac, a very classic Kerouac quote, "I have nothing to offer anyone except my own confusion." They kind of were out there as, we're not like society, we don't understand why we conform, and they were challenging that because they just didn't understand, while the rest of America was just accepting it. So now that we've covered challenges to conformity, and we'll go deeper into some of this in class, you want to use your study guide to get your notes done, study, and get ready for not only your quiz, but also your unit test, which is coming up now that we've finished the entire study guide. Make sure you bring any questions you have to class.